to listen to your word, to analyze the history, to realize where we are today, where we have been so far, and where are we going. We pray in the blessed name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Am I on now? No? Yeah?
I hear you. I'm good here.
Yeah, I'm just, what is going on? Come and check me. Maybe I'm dead. Well, to you, I am not. But to those, yes. See, now I am alive. I can project my voice okay, especially in this acoustics, but no matter how well do I project my voice, the guys at the control booth who are trying to project it over the internet won't be able to hear it. It is interesting that I began my ministry back in 1992 when I taught a church history to a group of new believers who were going to become Sabbath school teachers. I haven't taught church history since. And 25 years later, deja vu. We are completing the course of a history of Christianity and Judaism, looking at it from the prophetic perspective presented in the book of Revelation in the letter to 7 churches. And here we made quite a journey from Ephesus to Philadelphia. We went on quite a roller coaster ride, but I think you are realizing that this is what the church had done. As soon as apostles, the last apostles died, the church took a steep dive through Smyrna, Pergamos, down to Thyatira. And then Reformation, whose anniversary we are remembering this year, was the vehicle that began to pull the church back out of the pit which it got itself into. And we looked at Sardis. We found that Sardis, even though it does pull the church out, there are deficiencies in Sardis period which did not allow it to become fully alive. And that's why God says, sorry, because you're not fully alive, you're dead. And so Philadelphia, that is the interesting period. Look at the words of Jesus with which he addresses the Philadelphia church. I know your works. See, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it. For you have a little strength, have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Positive characteristics. Indeed, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and they are not, but lie. Indeed, I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you, because you have kept my command to persevere. I also will keep you from hour of trial, which shall come upon whole world, to test those who dwell on the earth. Behold, I'm coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown. Among all 7 churches, this one has no negative remarks. There is nothing, I have something against you. There is none like this. It's just straightforward. Have a strength, a little bit, not a huge strength, but a little. Kept the word and have not denied my name. But I want to point our attention to the phrase here. Look at this. Those of synagogue of Satan who say they're Jews and are not, but lie indeed. But lie, I don't need indeed. This phrase has already occurred once. Look at this. Don't you remember it? Addressed to Smyrna, these mysterious Jews who are not but the synagogue of Satan. Going back to this matrix, it is very interesting to see how each period on both sides of this bell curve, they're in a way parallel. Pergamos and Sardis have issues. Thyatira has no parallels. This is unparalleled apostasy. But Smyrna and Philadelphia seem to be having parallels. And this synagogue of Satan business is very interesting. Here, Jesus makes statement that there are those who blaspheme, and those who blaspheme, they say they're Jews, but are not, but the synagogue of Satan. Well, this is kind of an interesting logic here, because we talked about the possibility back in the time of Smyrna that this is talking about those who deny the law and the Sabbath. And unfortunately, as we studied Smyrna and we read different writings of different church fathers, we have found ample evidences of the existence of those people who really deny all the roots of whatever is Jewish, Hebraic, Old Testament, and things like this. But here in Philadelphia, these type of people are worshiping at the angel of the Philadelphia church feet. Isn't this interesting? Well, let's take a look at some of them. This little building, it's the house in London. Before this house was built, As you can see in the windows, you have an interesting name. It's called Mill Land Seventh-day Baptist Church. There was a church there. So to understand the sources of Philadelphia, and you notice the pattern here, the way how we are learning about each period. To understand what happened in Thyatira, we need to study Smyrna and Pergamum. To understand what is happening in Philadelphia, we need to go back to the roots of English Protestantism. Back in England, what happens is Henry VIII makes the quasi-reformation. We talked about that. Why it's quasi? Because it changes nothing. It remains, the church stays with its sacrament. The only thing which really changes is the allegiance. Now the king is the head of the church. And so in 1559, the Parliament makes a special decree of uniformity. Uniformity means that basically you are supposed to go to your Anglican parish, and that's where you belong to. And if you do something else, if you don't follow the beliefs and the liturgical practices of the Church of England, you're a heretic. So what Henry VIII did, he commissioned to the first Archbishop of Canterbury, well, not the first, but it was the first Archbishop of Canterbury that would not be subservient to the Pope. He was Thomas Cranmer. He commissioned to him to produce a new prayer book. That prayer book became the foundation. All the hymns, you know, sometimes in some old hymnals, I'm not sure, maybe some of this exists in those hymnals here. They created, you know, they took out Latin, basically. And so they created an Anglican style of liturgy. Very pompous, just the Catholicism in English language. After the Second Vatican Council, when Catholic Church encouraged local dioceses to switch into local languages and kind of a little bit abandon Latin, for American and English dioceses, it was very easy. Cranmer's book, prayer book, was a good blueprint, and it really was the same as Catholic liturgy. However, there were those who didn't wish to conform. And they've been in troubles. They wanted, you know, more biblical, less pompous, and they wanted it to be devoid of all kinds of traditions and other Catholic rituals which were just anglicized. And these people, and you see their pictures, different theologians, leaders of the church, they called themselves Puritans. The word speaks in English of itself, pure. They wanted a pure, simple faith. Puritans were really into a biblical simplicity, sometimes too much of a simplicity. Puritan worship was pure sermon. They detested the English traditions which were popular under Henry VIII. For example, the way how Henry VIII did Christmas. It was interesting. Christmas for Henry VIII was the time when his subjects, counts, dukes, lords, whatever, could come to the court to express loyalty. So it was a big reception. He had a 2-3 days reception where all of this English novelty and establishment would line up to the court. And guess what they were doing? They were bringing king the gifts. And that was the major part of the Anglican Christmas. The king wanted to receive the gifts. I received question about modern American, I call it quasi-Christian Christmas. And the reason why I call it quasi-Christian Christmas, because I know everybody except, I don't know, Jews or whatever here, does Christmas. But last August, during the Clarke County Fair, we did a little test. Our congregation, we set the booth. Maybe someone of you passed by this booth. We had our Torah scroll, the wall, and everything. And we had a planko board game. And so the children were supposed to play the planka game, receive the little prize down on the bottom, but before they do this, they would have to answer question to get the ball. So the majority of question was where Jesus was born. And people had a hard time answering. And we would ask them, do you parents do Christmas? Of course we do Christmas. But where was Jesus born? They wouldn't know. And this is what I call a quasi-Christian Christmas. Of course, we already talked how the date was established, but that kind of a twist. See, the question which I received, whether or not we follow Catholic tradition of Christmas, no, we don't. We most of Americans follow Anglican tradition of Christmas. This is Henry VIII Christmas. The term Merry Christmas appears at the times of Henry VIII, because while all the people were waiting to be received by the king and receive the Christmas blessing from the king and express their loyalty with a gift, Henry VIII would really give everybody Merry Christmas. London was really, really merry during the Christmas. whatever they had, whiskey, not vodka, brandy, whatever, ale, whatever kind of other type of entertainment was flowing like a river, and people were drinking and they were merry, and Puritans detested it. They fought against it. When Puritans arrived in the United States, they said, "No Christmas here on this land." It's interesting. Puritans, among the Puritans, and it was an interesting figure. I don't have him on a slide. I've learned about him a couple years ago. His name was John Harvard, the founder of Harvard University. 1632, if I am correct, or 23. I can be mistaken here in the dates. But I know for a fact that, think about it, 160 years before the Revolutionary War, this was the first thing Puritans has done. They built the university, which is now Harvard University, named after John Harvard. Why did they do this? Because they believed in the necessity for people to make conscientious decision for Christ. And that's why they were into education. They didn't want people to follow just the tradition. They wanted people to learn the scripture, learn the original languages, be able to read the Bible, parse the text, learn the history, and make intelligent decisions for Christ. Puritans are I would say, the fathers of Christian education. Why? I don't have time to give you the name of all these people, the leaders and the founders of Puritans, but you know where they coming all from? Cambridge and Oxford. These were educated people. They wanted a pure faith, free from the tradition of man. Not that they were absolutely pure and faultless, I wouldn't say faultless. I would say without the shortcomings. This particular interested gentleman, Matthew Henry, whose commentary is very popular, he was among an interesting branch of Puritans. They were called Sabbatarian Puritans. Actually, in 1645, if I'm not mistaken, when, under the auspices of now United Kingdom with King James, the King of Scotland, is at the helm in London, so now it's a United Kingdom, the British Parliament enacted the Westminster Confession of Faith. And Puritan views, some of them, were included into the Westminster Confession of Faith. And one of their views was keeping the rest on the Sabbath day. Of course, you understand, what does the Sabbath day mean in English language? I have to translate this into Russian with a long commentary. But we know that in English language, before we jump and say hooray, we need to really ask the question, which day of the week is the Sabbath? Because Sabbatarian Puritans believed the Sabbath to be the first day of the week. And so what they were really pushing for purity of faith, no work or secular activity on the Sabbath, which is the first day of the week, because they were not happy with the laxness and complacencies of Anglicanism. You see? This is why Seventh-day Baptists, you see? SDBs, that's how they're called. They're different. They begin to, the first traces of the first Baptists, and I repeat the word Baptist because this is the English word for Anabaptists. They're a little different. I still don't know how, it's kind of different sources talk different things. They're nonconformists. Well, Anabaptists were also not nonconformists, but when we say Anabaptists, we're talking German. We're talking Konrad Grebel, who, and they were nonconformists because they didn't want, one of the key characteristic of the Anabaptists is actually their plight for separation between church and state. And so in Germany, in Switzerland especially, they were dying for this. And from Holland and Germany, they were pushed away and had to cross the ocean and settle here. Some of the Mennonites ended up in Russia. Nobody bothered them there. So this particular man was a Seventh-day Baptist. And if you know something about this man, he was the advocate of religious freedom. Whatever we have today as what known as the First Amendment, this man was one of the chief contributors for that. And he was the Seventh-day Baptist. In Rhode Island, he founded the first Seventh-day Baptist church. And Seventh-day Baptist churches were growing by leaps and bounds. By the beginning of 19th century, the Baptist movement in America was split evenly between those who were Seventh-day Baptists and those who were First-day Baptists. In fact, there is a story. I don't know if you have heard another denomination which is known as Church of Christ. There is a big university which belongs to Church of Christ in Cincinnati, Ohio. And at that university, they teach the class called History of Reformation. I was interested to look at their textbook, and I realized that what they call the Reformation is not what we were calling here. By Reformation, they do not imply Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and the 95 Theses. By the Reformation, they imply their history, which starts with the man by the name Alexander Campbell, who was a Presbyterian Scottish minister who arrived in the U.S., and I don't need to go into the details. They have a little bit of a fight. He arrives in the U.S. in somewhere the late 1700s, 1795 or something. So he gets disappointed with the inner struggle between two fractions within the Presbyterians in America. And he learns about the message of true baptism. He and his associates are rebaptized, making the covenant with the Lord, and join the Baptist movement. But 10 or so years later, Alexander Campbell expresses his bitter disappointment with Baptist movement because he sees that they are leaning toward the Jewish Sabbath. And he doesn't like all these discussions at their camp meetings. And he is strongly against any Jewish Sabbath keeping in Christian churches. And that's why he splits from the Baptist movement and organizes denomination which he calls Church of Christ, which he claims to be completely free from any Judaism and Sabbatarianism. So this is what is happening in the Philadelphia period. This is why the wording Jews who are not Jews but the synagogue of Satan being subdued are repeated. Philadelphia is commended for advancing and returning to biblical Sabbath. It would be 50 years later when a Seventh-day Baptist, Rachel Oakes from Long Island, moves to the village called Washington, New Hampshire, and meets with Pastor Willard of a Methodist background who is pastoring a former Methodist and current Adventist congregation. And during the communion, he speaks about 10 commandments, and Mrs. Oakes invites him for a visit and tells him, "Pastor, you are a hypocrite because you preach about 10 commandments and you don't follow them." So this is what convinced Pastor Willard to accept the 7-day Sabbath. And next Sunday, he came in front of his church in Washington, New Hampshire, and I visited this place when I lived in New York, a little closer to these events than I live now, but that's an interesting tour in the New England, which I took several times, learning about this 7-day movement, which was the Baptist movement. It was the Baptist people. That particular church in Long Island, the Seventh-day Baptist Church, prayed earnestly and fasted that the message of Sabbath would be spread around the world. And here, Rachel Oakes brings this message to a former Methodist Adventist pastor who, on the next Sunday, declares that this is going to be his last Sunday he's preaching at this church, and whoever wishes to hear him preach again need to come on a 7-day Sabbath. And this is how the message of Seventh-day Baptists created the name for Seventh-day Adventists. And it spread. And it's spreading now because there are many, many groups and churches like this who are accepting and discovering the Sabbath. There are many Russian people here in this area that are Sabbath-keeping people. And most of them come from the Pentecostal background. And when they come from the Pentecostal background, what they tell me the story, I ask them, why Sabbath? How did you come to the Sabbath? And they say, the Lord revealed to, and they would say, this person and that person in a dream about the Sabbath while we lived in USSR, and we began to observe the Sabbath day since. So this is Philadelphia. God commends Philadelphia for restoration the Sabbath. And it's very interesting. You see, when we look at parallel, Smyrna is the gradual loss of the Sabbath, and Philadelphia is gradual restoration of the truth about the Sabbath. Then you have Pergamum, which is a compromise between paganism and biblical Christianity. And you have Sardis, which is still half biblical, half Catholic. And so, what about the last seventh church? It's supposed to be parallel to Ephesus, isn't it? Well, about this church, you will find out after the short break.